What if the voice inside your head isn't actually yours? Right now, as you're listening to this, there's a subtle narrator running in the background of your mind. It comments on your decisions. It questions your ambitions. It tells you to slow down, to be careful, to stay realistic. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it shouts. But it always sounds familiar. So familiar that you assume it must be you. But what if that inner voice, the one that fuels your self-doubt, your hesitation, your fear of being seen, was programmed long before you had the ability to question it? In the world of self-development and mindset work, we talk a lot about limiting beliefs, subconscious patterns, emotional triggers, and identity. We analyze self-sabotage as if it's a character flaw, as if you are the problem. But the truth is far more unsettling and far more liberating. You didn't wake up one day and decide to doubt yourself. You learned it as a child. Your nervous system was in survival mode. You depended on external authority, your parents, caregivers, teachers, not just for guidance, but for emotional safety. And when they spoke, your brain didn't filter. It absorbed. Their tone became your internal tone. Their fears became your invisible boundaries. Their unresolved wounds quietly shaped your internal structure. Maybe they said, "Don't aim too high." Maybe it was, "People like us don't do that." Maybe it was silence when you needed encouragement, or criticism disguised as protection. Children don't interpret these messages logically. They internalize them. When love is mixed with fear, the subconscious doesn't separate the two. It fuses them, and that fusion becomes identity. This is how programming happens. The brain wires itself around repetition and emotional intensity. If a message carries authority and emotional charge, it becomes a neural pathway. Over time, that pathway doesn't feel foreign. It feels like truth. It feels like your personality. It feels like who you are. But what if your inner critic is not your personality, but inherited fear? What if the voice that tells you you're not ready is simply an echo? This is where shadow work begins. Not in blaming your parents, not in rejecting your past, but in recognizing that much of what you call myself was formed before you had conscious choice. Your subconscious patterns were built during years when your only priority was attachment and survival. And here's the uncomfortable part. The mind will defend this inherited voice. It will tell you it's being realistic, responsible, mature. It will convince you that shrinking is wisdom, that hesitation is intelligence, that playing small is safety, because safety was once survival. If your internal dialogue feels harsh, critical, or constantly cautious, that's not random. That's conditioning. That's the architecture of your early environment, still operating in your adult decisions, in your money, your relationships, your visibility, your confidence. And until you separate your authentic identity from the programming you inherited, you'll keep mistaking protection for truth. So before we talk about healing or reprogramming your mindset, we need to understand how protection slowly transformed into programming, and how love, mixed with fear, became the voice that now tries to control your expansion. And if, while listening to this, something inside you feels exposed, that's not an accident. It means you recognize this voice. Maybe you've caught yourself repeating phrases you swore you would never say. Maybe you felt that invisible tension before making a bold decision. Maybe you've sensed that every time you try to expand, something inside pulls you back to what is familiar, even if what's familiar is small. If this resonates with you, take a second right now and gently acknowledge it. You're not broken. You were programmed. And if you've ever felt that internal sabotage, that quiet voice telling you to doubt yourself, comment below. I've felt this. Not for me. For you. Because awareness grows stronger when it's spoken. And when you write it, you interrupt the silence that kept it hidden. Also, Leave a like on this video if you believe that understanding your subconscious patterns is the first step toward real transformation. When you engage, you're not just supporting the channel, you're reinforcing your own commitment to consciousness. You're signaling to your mind this conversation matters. And if this is the kind of deep identity work, shadow integration, and mental reprogramming you've been searching for, make sure you subscribe. This channel isn't about surface-level motivation. It's about dismantling the invisible architecture shaping your reality. It's about seeing the patterns most people never question. Because once you start recognizing the origin of the voice in your head, you can begin separating it from who you truly are. And in the next part, we're going to explore something crucial: how protection in childhood slowly transformed into programming, and how love mixed with fear became the foundation of your inner critic. So let's look closer at how protection slowly became programming. Because this is where everything starts to make sense. When you were a child, you didn't have critical thinking about identity, subconscious patterns, or emotional conditioning. You had one primary instinct: stay connected, stay safe, stay loved. Your nervous system was wired for attachment, not analysis. And that changes everything. When your parents spoke, their words didn't land as opinions. They landed as truth. Not because they were always right, but because they were authority. In a developing brain, authority imprints directly into the subconscious. That's how mental programming happens. Repetition plus emotional intensity equals belief. And belief becomes identity. Imagine a small moment. You're excited about something. You say you want to be seen, to try, to create, to shine. And the response you receive carries fear. That's risky. Don't embarrass yourself. Be realistic. Maybe it wasn't even harsh. Maybe it was subtle. A sigh, a dismissive look, a quick redirection. But your nervous system registered it. Not as information, as correction. And here's the part that most people miss in shadow work. The child doesn't think, my parent is projecting their unresolved trauma. The child thinks, something about me must be wrong. So you adjust. You shrink the dream. You soften the voice. You disconnect from the impulse to expand. Because expansion felt unsafe. This is how self-sabotage is born. Not from weakness. From adaptation. Your brain learned that belonging required modification. If confidence triggered tension, you toned it down. If ambition triggered criticism, you made it smaller. If emotions triggered discomfort, you buried them. These adjustments weren't conscious decisions. They were survival strategies. And survival strategies, repeated long enough, become subconscious patterns. Over time, those external voices stop needing to be external. The brain internalizes authority to maintain predictability. That's how identity formation works. The voice that once came from outside now lives inside. And because it sounds familiar, it feels like you. But listen carefully to your inner dialogue the next time you hesitate. Notice the tone. Is it compassionate? Or does it carry shame? Is it curious? Or is it dismissive? Does it encourage growth? Or does it emphasize danger? Most inner critics don't sound original. They sound inherited, and the mind protects what is familiar. Even if what is familiar limits you. The subconscious prefers predictable pain over unpredictable freedom. That's why transformation feels threatening. When you attempt to reprogram your mindset, the inner voice gets louder. Not because you're failing, but because the system is trying to. Maintain the identity it built for survival. Protection becomes programming when fear is repeated, often enough to feel like personality. Maybe your parents believed money was scarce, so when you try to charge more, you feel guilt. Maybe they feared judgment, so when you try to show up publicly, you feel exposed. Maybe they learned that love had conditions, So now you overextend, overgive, and call it loyalty. This isn't random. This is emotional conditioning embedded in your subconscious architecture. And here's something even deeper. Your brain associated their voice with safety. So even if that voice criticizes you, even if it shames you, even if it tells you to stay small, a part of you still interprets it as protection. Because at one point in your life, obedience meant connection. So the internal saboteur isn't evil. It's loyal. Loyal to an outdated survival blueprint. But loyalty to the past can quietly sabotage your future. The more you begin to observe this, the more you realize something unsettling. Many of your automatic thoughts were installed before you had the ability to choose them. Your limiting beliefs were not created by adult logic. They were encoded through emotional imprinting. And once you see that, something shifts. Not yet freedom, not yet full transformation, but awareness. The first crack in the structure, because if the voice was installed, it can be examined. If it was inherited, it can be separated. And that separation is where identity work truly begins, where you start distinguishing between who you were conditioned to be and who you actually are beneath the subconscious programming. And once you begin that distinction, you start noticing patterns you couldn't see before, especially in the moments where your mind insists it's simply being careful, realistic, mature. If this part is resonating deeply, and you can recognize at least one inherited phrase that shaped your identity, write in the comments, "This wasn't my voice," not as blame, as awareness. Because naming the pattern weakens its grip. When protection turns into programming, it rarely looks dramatic. It doesn't happen in one explosive moment. It happens in small, repeated emotional exchanges that slowly teach you who you're allowed to be. Your parents didn't wake up one day deciding to install an inner saboteur inside you. Most of them were carrying their own subconscious patterns, inherited fears, scarcity beliefs, unprocessed shame, emotional wounds they never had the tools to heal. And without realizing it, they passed those patterns forward. This is how generational conditioning works. If they were taught that money is unstable, they may have spoken about risk with anxiety. If they were criticized for expressing emotion, they may have minimized yours. If they grew up believing success leads to rejection, they may have subtly discouraged your ambition. Not because they wanted to limit you, but because their nervous system equated expansion with danger. Children don't interpret this as "my parent is afraid." They interpret it as "I should be afraid too." And because your subconscious mind was still forming, those emotional reactions became your internal blueprint. Think about how identity is built. Not through logic, but through repetition and emotional charge. When a message is repeated in a state of vulnerability, especially by someone you depend on, it bypasses conscious filtering and embeds directly into the subconscious. That's why certain phrases still echo in your mind years later. Be careful. Don't get your hopes up. Who do you think you are? Play it safe. At first, those words were guidance. Over time, they became mental programming. Protection is necessary in childhood. You needed boundaries. You needed caution. You needed someone to help you survive a world you didn't yet understand. But survival-based guidance is not designed to support expansion. It's designed to minimize threat. And when protection is overused or infused with unresolved fear, it quietly shapes your self-concept. You start associating visibility with exposure, success with pressure, confidence with arrogance, risk with abandonment. These associations are not conscious choices. They're subconscious pairings created in early emotional experiences. So when you grow up and try to step into something bigger, a new business, a new relationship dynamic, a new identity, your inner voice activates. Not to destroy you, to protect the blueprint it was built on. It says, slow down. It says, what if you fail? It says, don't embarrass yourself. And because that tone feels familiar, it feels wise. But here's the subtle shift. What once kept you safe is now keeping you small. This is the moment where many people misunderstand themselves. They believe they lack discipline, confidence, clarity. They assume something is wrong with their personality. But often, what they're experiencing is a subconscious loyalty to inherited fear. Protection became programming. The moment your nervous system confused caution with identity. And there's an emotional layer here that's important. You may even feel resistance listening to this. A part of you wants to defend your parents, to say they did their best. And that may be true. This isn't about blame. It's about awareness, because you can honor their effort while still recognizing the impact. Shadow work doesn't require anger. It requires honesty. When love is mixed with fear, the child absorbs both. And if fear was repeated often enough, it became part of your internal language. That language now shapes your mindset, your decisions, your sense of possibility. The deeper truth is this. Your inner critic often speaks in the emotional tone of someone who once loved you, but didn't know how to regulate their own fear. And that realization changes everything. Because once you see that, the voice inside your head may be an echo of someone else's anxiety. You start questioning whether it deserves authority over your future. And when that question arises, when you begin to separate protection from programming, you naturally start noticing something else. How that inherited voice is still influencing your adult life in very specific, measurable ways. Now this is where it becomes real, because it's one thing to understand that your inner voice was inherited. It's another thing to realize that it's still running your adult life. You can see it most clearly in the moments that matter. You're about to raise your prices, and suddenly you feel irresponsible. You're about to post something vulnerable, and you feel exposed. You're about to say no, and guilt floods your body. You're about to try something bigger, and a quiet tension whispers, who do you think you are? That's not random anxiety. That's subconscious programming activating. Your brain is built to prioritize familiarity over fulfillment. It doesn't care about your potential. It cares about safety. And safety, in your early identity formation, was defined by compliance, predictability, and emotional regulation within your family system. So when you attempt expansion, more visibility, more money, more autonomy, your nervous system scans for threat. Not physical threat, emotional threat, rejection, judgment, loss of belonging. And the inner saboteur steps in. It doesn't scream, stay small forever. It's more subtle than that. It disguises itself as logic. Wait a little longer. You need more credentials. Now isn't the right time. Don't be dramatic. Be realistic. It sounds mature, responsible, balanced. Underneath that tone is an old emotional imprint. Expansion once felt unsafe. Your subconscious patterns are loyal to the environment that shaped them. If your childhood rewarded humility, but punished boldness, you will unconsciously shrink to maintain internal stability. If your family associated success with pressure or conflict, you may sabotage opportunities that would elevate you, not because you don't want them, but because your nervous system equates elevation with danger. This is why self-sabotage often appears right before growth. You're not afraid of success itself. You're afraid of what success once meant in your emotional memory. Maybe it meant being criticized. Maybe it meant being envied. Maybe it meant being isolated. Maybe it meant being told you were too much. So, your brain chooses the safer option. Delay, overthink, self-doubt, and then you interpret that delay as lack of discipline, as lack of confidence. as proof that you're not ready. But what if readiness isn't the issue? What if your inner critic is simply a younger version of you, trying to prevent emotional pain that no longer exists? Because here's the paradox. The inner saboteur feels like your enemy, but it was created as a protector. It learned that shrinking reduced tension. That silence avoided conflict. That caution preserved connection. So when you try to step into a new identity, more confident, more expressive, more powerful, it panics. Not because it hates your growth, but because growth violates the original survival agreement. The subconscious mind doesn't update automatically. It runs old scripts until they're consciously interrupted. And that's why awareness alone can feel destabilizing. Once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. You start noticing how often that inherited voice shapes your decisions. You begin to question whether your personality is actually a collection of adaptive strategies. You might even catch yourself mid-thought and wonder, is this really me speaking? That question is powerful, because when you begin separating identity from programming, you create space. And in that space, something unfamiliar starts to emerge. Not louder, not dramatic, but steady. A different tone. One that isn't built on fear. But before you can strengthen that new voice, you have to understand how to consciously separate yourself from the old one. Because knowing the pattern exists isn't enough. You need to know how to dismantle its authority without creating internal war. And that's where the real shift begins. So how do you separate the voice from your identity without fighting yourself? Because this is where many people get stuck. They discover the pattern. They recognize the subconscious programming. And then they try to silence it aggressively. They try to kill the inner critic. But that approach usually backfires. Remember, the inner saboteur was created as protection. If you attack it, your nervous system interprets that as internal danger, and the resistance only grows stronger. Separation doesn't require violence. It requires awareness and authority. The first shift is subtle but powerful. You stop saying, I am insecure, and you start saying, part of me feels insecure. That linguistic change might seem small, but it's profound in identity work. It creates distance between who you are and the subconscious pattern you inherited. When you say, I'm not confident, you fuse yourself with the program. When you say, a protective part of me is afraid, you step into the observer, and the observer is where power lives. This is shadow work in practice. Not blaming your past, not denying your emotions, but recognizing that your inner dialogue is not your essence. It's conditioning. It's learned language. It's an outdated survival script. The second shift is questioning authority. When that voice appears, don't do it. You're not ready. This will go wrong. Instead of automatically obeying it, pause and ask, who does this sound like? When did I first feel this tone? What was I trying to protect back then? You're not dismissing the voice. You're investigating it. Most people have never examined their internal narrative. They assume every thought deserves obedience. But not every thought is truth. Many are echoes. And when you trace an echo back to its origin, something changes. The voice loses its absolute power. It becomes contextual, human, fallible. Then comes the third shift. Conscious reprogramming. You don't replace fear with blind positivity. That's superficial. You replace inherited fear with grounded authority. Adult authority. The version of you who has more data, more experience, more emotional regulation than the child who first absorbed the message. Instead of, this is dangerous, you say, this feels unfamiliar and I can handle unfamiliar. Instead of, I'll embarrass myself, you say, growth requires visibility. Instead of, who do I think I am? You say, I am allowed to evolve. Reprogramming isn't about lying to yourself. It's about updating the system. Your subconscious patterns were built on old emotional associations. When you repeatedly choose expansion while regulating your nervous system, you create new associations. Visibility without abandonment. Success without rejection. Confidence without punishment. And slowly, the internal tone begins to shift, not because the old voice disappears overnight, but because it no longer holds authority. You become the authority. You stop outsourcing your identity to inherited conditioning. You stop mistaking familiarity for truth. You stop letting protection dictate your potential. And here's the deeper realization. Your parents' voice shaped you. Yes, but it doesn't define you. It influenced your internal architecture, but it is not your core consciousness. There is a part of you beneath the programming, a steady awareness that was never damaged, never limited, never afraid. The more you strengthen that awareness, the less control the inherited voice has. This is where real transformation begins. Not when the inner critic disappears, but when you no longer confuse it with yourself. If this resonated deeply, write in the comments, I choose my own voice, not as motivation, as a declaration of identity. And if you're committed to dismantling subconscious patterns, reprogramming your mindset, and rebuilding your identity consciously, make sure you're subscribed. This is the work most people avoid, but it's the work that changes everything. And in the next conversation, we're going to explore how to detect the exact sentence from childhood that still controls your adult decisions, and how to neutralize it at its root. Here is a refined, more cinematic and emotionally layered version of your topic 4, keeping the same structure, but elevating the rhythm, depth, and psychological impact to align perfectly with reality blueprint's identity. So how do you separate the voice from your identity without going to war with yourself? This is where most people collapse back into the old pattern. They finally recognize the subconscious programming. They see the inherited fear. They identify the inner critic. And then they try to destroy it. They try to silence it. They try to overpower it. They try to shame it into disappearing. But the moment you attack that voice, your nervous system tightens, because that voice was built as protection. And when you fight protection, the system interprets that as danger. Resistance grows. The truth is, separation is not violence. Separation is awareness. And awareness gives you authority. The first shift is almost invisible, but psychologically radical. You stop saying, I am insecure, and you begin saying, a part of me feels insecure. That one linguistic adjustment creates distance between your core identity and the inherited survival script. It moves you from fusion to observation. When you say, I'm not confident, you merge with the program. When you say, a protective part of me is afraid, you step into the observer, and the observer is where your real power lives. This is shadow work in its mature form. Not blaming your parents, not denying your emotional responses, not pretending you're unaffected, but recognizing that your internal dialogue is learned language shaped by early emotional conditioning, not your essence. You are not your programming. You are the awareness of your programming. The second shift is questioning authority. When that voice surfaces, don't risk it. You're not ready. This will go wrong. Pause. Instead of obeying it automatically, investigate it. Who does this sound like? When did I first feel this tone? What was happening in my life when this belief was formed? You are not dismissing the voice. You are contextualizing it. Most people never examine their internal narrative. They assume every thought deserves obedience. But thoughts are not commands. Many are echoes, recordings from a time when you were smaller, more dependent, more vulnerable. And once you trace an echo back to its origin, something subtle but powerful happens. The voice loses its absolute authority. It becomes human. Imperfect, Limited, outdated, comes the third shift. Conscious reprogramming, not toxic. POSITIVI, not denial, not pretending fear doesn't exist, but upgrading the system. You replace inherited fear with grounded adult authority. The version of you that has lived, learned, survived, evolved. The version of you who understands that unfamiliar does not mean unsafe. Instead of, this is dangerous, you say, this feels unfamiliar, and I can handle unfamiliar. Instead of, I'll embarrass myself, you say, growth requires visibility. Instead of, who do I think I am? You say, I am allowed to evolve beyond who I was taught to be. Reprogramming is not lying to yourself. It is updating the operating system. Your subconscious patterns were wired through emotional association. When you repeatedly choose expansion while regulating your nervous system instead of abandoning yourself, you begin building new associations, visibility without rejection, success without punishment, confidence without abandonment, and slowly the internal tone shifts, not because the old voice vanishes overnight, but because it no longer defines you. You become the authority. In your own internal landscape, you stop outsourcing your identity to inherited conditioning. You stop mistaking familiarity for truth. You stop letting survival strategies dictate your potential. And then a deeper realization emerges. Yes, your parents' voice shaped your internal architecture, but it does not define your consciousness. There is something beneath the PROGRAMMINGA, steady awareness. Core identity untouched by fear. The more you strengthen that awareness, the weaker the inherited voice becomes. Transformation does not begin when the inner critic disappears. It begins when you stop confusing it with yourself. If this resonates deeply, write in the comments, I choose my own voice, not as motivation, but as a declaration of identity. And if you're committed to dismantling subconscious patterns, reclaiming authority over your mindset, and consciously rebuilding your identity, subscribe. This channel is not about surface-level inspiration. It's about rewiring the invisible structure shaping your reality. Because next, we're going to uncover something even more precise: how to identify the exact sentence from childhood that still controls your adult decisions, and how to neutralize it at its root.